Basically, we have two big triangles, a matched pair. And so your boat would suspend right here from a cross member.
That's kind of what we tried to do. Where there was chaos, we tried to create a little more order. Where something was messed up, we tried to fix it. Where something was ugly, we tried to make it beautiful.
For years, people have whispered about what might be hidden beneath Turtle Island, Eustace Conway's sprawling wilderness home deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Those who have walked its winding trails speak of something unusual, something that stirs the air when the wind moves through the forest. Some called it a myth, others a secret he'd take to his grave. But no one imagined the truth would be this strange. When explorers finally uncovered what lay beneath his land, a secret tunnel system built by Eustace himself, what they found inside left everyone speechless. Turtle Island had always been more than a home. To Eustace, it was a living, breathing testament to freedom, a place where the spirit of self-reliance could thrive without the noise of the modern world. He built it with his own hands, log by log, stone by stone, guided not by blueprints but by instinct and faith. It was his rebellion against an age that had forgotten how to live close to the earth. Those who knew him best said he moved through the woods like a ghost, quiet, deliberate, carrying centuries of wisdom in his stride. But beneath that stillness was a man driven by something deeper, something hidden. Eustace wasn't just a man living in the wilderness. He was a man at war with time. The modern world, with its machines, screens, and endless noise, was to him a kind of sickness. He saw Turtle Island as a cure, a place where the ancient balance between man and nature could still exist. Yet those who visited the property often noticed something else. They'd catch glimpses of odd, narrow doors built into the hillsides, stone-lined paths that led to nowhere, heavy timbers set into the ground like sealed entrances. It was as if the land itself held its breath, hiding something that didn't want to be found. Locals began to trade stories. Some said the tunnels were built as part of an old survival plan, a network of passages for storing food, tools, and supplies in case civilization collapsed. Others whispered that Eustace had built them to escape, not from danger but from people. He'd often talk about solitude as a sacred thing, about how being alone in the earth's silence was the only way to hear the truth of life. Maybe, they said, those tunnels were his way of returning to the womb of the earth itself, disappearing into the one thing that never lied to him: nature. But the truth, as it turned out, was far stranger than anyone could have guessed. It started with a storm, one of those mountain tempests that seemed to tear open the sky. The rain fell for days, and the rivers that wound through Turtle Island swelled beyond their banks. When the storm finally broke, a group of volunteers who helped maintain the property noticed part of a hillside had collapsed. Beneath the roots of an old oak, something glimmered faintly in the mud, a section of hand-hewn timber dark with age. When they cleared the debris, they realized it wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a doorway. At first, they thought it might be one of Eustace's old storage cellars. But when they pried it open, the air that escaped was cold, still, and heavy, the kind of air that hasn't seen sunlight in decades. Inside was a narrow tunnel, lined with rough stone and timber supports sloping downward into darkness. Someone had built this by hand, and whoever it was had worked with patience and purpose. The volunteers hesitated. They knew better than to disturb anything Eustace had made. Turtle Island wasn't just land. It was philosophy carved into soil. Still, curiosity pulled them forward. The deeper they went, the more they realized this was no simple storage tunnel. It twisted and turned like the roots of a tree, descending into chambers that looked impossibly well crafted for something hidden so long. Old lantern hooks still clung to the walls. Bits of tools lay rusting in the corners. And along the earthen floor, faint traces of animal tracks, maybe raccoons, maybe something older, told of life moving through the darkness long after its creator had left it behind. Then in one chamber they found something that froze them in place. There was a bench, rough-hewn, made from oak. On it sat a worn leather-bound journal, sealed in wax to keep it from moisture. And next to it a carving, a turtle hand-chiseled from stone. Its shell was etched with a map, not of Turtle Island as it exists above ground, but of something far larger beneath it. The tunnel stretched farther than anyone could imagine, winding deep beneath the mountain. When word of the discovery reached those who knew Eustace, reactions were mixed. Some refused to believe it. He'd never hide something like that, they said. Others smiled quietly, saying it sounded exactly like him, the kind of secret a man who lived by his own code would build and keep. But for those who had walked beside him, who had listened to him speak about the sacred connection between life, earth, and death, the tunnel wasn't just a structure. It was a message. Eustace had always said the earth remembers everything, that when man builds something in harmony with it, not against it, it becomes part of the living story of the land. To him, digging a tunnel wasn't about hiding. It was about listening. Every stone removed, every inch of soil turned, was a dialogue between man and the mountain. And now, decades later, that dialogue had been uncovered again, waiting in silence to be heard. As night fell over Turtle Island, the volunteers sealed the entrance back up, leaving it as they found it. But the story couldn't be buried again. Something about it felt bigger, as if the tunnel wasn't just beneath the mountain but beneath the surface of everything Eustace ever stood for. The question wasn't what he had built, but why. And as the whispers spread, the mystery of Eustace Conway deepened. A man who lived for the truth of the wild, yet carried within him a secret that the wilderness itself had hidden for him all these years. Days passed, but the image of that tunnel lingered in everyone's minds. The volunteers couldn't shake it. The silence, the carvings, that strange map etched into stone. It felt like a whisper from another time, as if Eustace himself was speaking through the mountain. Word eventually reached a small group of naturalists and craftsmen who had worked closely with him over the years. Men and women who understood that everything Eustace built had meaning. They decided to go back, not as intruders but as students retracing the steps of a teacher who had spent his life uncovering truths the world had forgotten. They came quietly, bringing only lamps, rope, and reverence. The tunnel entrance had partially collapsed again from the rain, as though the earth was reluctant to give up its secret. But when they cleared it, the same cold breath of underground air greeted them, dense, still, alive with the smell of damp soil and cedar. It was like stepping into another realm, one that didn't belong to time. The deeper they went, the more they began to sense the rhythm of the man who made it. Each beam of wood was cut with precision. Each turn in the tunnel seemed deliberate, guiding them through a living maze that followed the veins of the mountain itself. There was no randomness to it, no desperation. This wasn't a man hiding from the world. It was a man designing a sanctuary. Every few meters they found markers carved into the stone. Small symbols Eustace had used for decades. A feather, a spiral, the outline of a turtle shell. To those who knew his teachings, these symbols carried deep meaning. The spiral represented life's constant cycle, the turning of seasons, the endless rebirth of all things. The feather, a reminder of freedom, of the lightness of spirit. And the turtle, the very name of his land, that stood for endurance, patience, and balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. As they pressed deeper, the air grew colder. Their lights revealed strange alcoves built into the tunnel walls, miniature rooms, some no larger than a closet. Inside were remnants of tools, hand-carved wooden pegs and bundles of straw that had long turned to dust. In one chamber they found a forge, crude but functional, with old bellows and bits of blackened iron. It was as if Eustace had built an entire underground workshop, hidden from the eyes of the world. One of the explorers whispered that he might have used it to craft survival tools or blades during the winter months. But another, a woman who had studied with him at Turtle Island, said softly that this wasn't about survival at all. This, she murmured, running her hand along the soot-darkened stones, was about devotion. To Eustace, craftsmanship was sacred, a form of prayer expressed through labor. Every knife, every shelter, every fire started from flint was an act of gratitude to the earth. It wasn't about possession or production. It was about communion. The deeper they went, the more this truth became clear. The tunnels weren't meant to hide from society. They were meant to connect, to the soil, to silence, to something ancient. After several turns, they reached a section where the tunnel widened suddenly into a vast underground chamber. The walls here were reinforced with thick timber beams and the ceiling arched like the ribs of a great animal. In the center stood something unexpected, a long wooden table covered in dust surrounded by 7 handmade chairs. On the table lay old candles melted down to stubs and a single lantern still hanging above, rusted but intact. The explorers stood in awe. This wasn't just a workshop, it was a gathering place. One of them noticed the floor. It wasn't dirt here. It was stone, laid carefully in a spiral pattern leading to the center. Embedded in the middle of that spiral was a flat rock carved with words so faint it took several minutes to read. "The earth beneath our feet is not dead. It is the pulse of eternity." It was in Eustace's handwriting. The room seemed to hum with meaning. You could almost feel his presence there, as if he had sat at that table speaking to the mountain, listening to the stories the wind carried through the tunnels. There was no electricity, no sound of engines, only the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance and the soft hiss of the lanterns they carried. The silence felt alive, full of echoes that didn't belong to human memory. One explorer began sketching the markings on the walls. Another started taking photographs for documentation. But something about the space made them uneasy, and not in fear, but in reverence. They realized this wasn't just a structure of wood and stone. It was a map of a man's mind. The way the tunnels spiraled outward, the way the chambers grew larger and more intentional, it was as if Eustace had been carving his own philosophy into the mountain. The tunnel was his journal, his life written in the language of Earth. Then at the far end of the chamber they noticed another tunnel, narrower, descending sharply downward. It was almost hidden behind a support beam. The opening looked unstable, the ground slick from moisture. They hesitated, debating whether to go on. But something about that hidden passage called to them. Eustace's map, found carved into the turtle stone near the entrance, had shown one final chamber at the very bottom, one labeled only with a single word, Origin. They descended slowly, the air thick with silence. The deeper they went, the more the walls began to glisten, streaks of mineral deposits catching their lantern light like faint stars. The tunnel grew tighter, the temperature dropping with every step. And then, suddenly, it opened into a space unlike anything they had seen before. It wasn't a man-made chamber. It was a natural cavern, enormous and dome-shaped, hidden entirely beneath the ridge. In the center was a small underground spring, its water crystal clear, fed by veins running through the rock. Around it were carved wooden stools and shelves stacked with glass jars, all sealed and labeled in Eustace's handwriting. Herbs, roots, seeds, fragments of the wilderness preserved like relics. Some were decades old. This was where he had come time and again to gather and preserve the living essence of the mountain. One explorer knelt beside the spring, shining their light into the water. The reflection revealed something carved into the stone just beneath the surface. A circle surrounding the letter E. No last name. No inscription. Just the mark of a man who had built his life on the principle that meaning doesn't need explanation. The realization settled over them slowly. This wasn't about secrecy. This was about eternity. Eustace had built his tunnels not to escape the world, but to join it more deeply, to root himself so completely into the mountain that even after he was gone, part of him would remain alive beneath the soil. For a long while no one spoke. The sound of the spring filled the air, quiet and constant. It felt like the beating heart of Turtle Island itself. They left the chamber in silence, carrying with them more questions than answers. Who was Eustace Conway, really? A man running from the modern world? Or a prophet who saw what the rest of us were too afraid to see? As they emerged into the daylight again, the wind rushed through the trees almost as if the mountain was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. And in that moment they understood something profound. The tunnel system wasn't a monument or a mystery to be solved. It was a mirror, a reflection of a man's journey to understand life by walking deeper into the heart of the earth itself. But there was still one unanswered question, the one everyone whispered about afterward. That second tunnel, the one marked Origin on Eustace's map, didn't end at the spring. There was another passage branching off behind it, sealed shut with heavy stone, and carved into it, barely visible under centuries of dust, were the words, "This is where the journey leads." When the explorers returned a third time, the forest seemed to greet them differently. The air over Turtle Island was heavy with anticipation, as if the land itself knew they were about to cross a threshold Eustace never meant for others to find. Days of rain had softened the earth again, and mist clung low over the trees. They stood before the sealed passage deep in the cavern, the one marked with those haunting words, "This is where the journey leads." For a long time, none of them spoke. It didn't feel like breaking into a secret. It felt like opening a grave. They began carefully, brushing away the layers of dust and earth from the stones. The seal was old but deliberate, fitted tightly, mortared with clay, reinforced with timbers that had darkened to the color of night. Whoever closed it hadn't meant for it to be opened easily. One of the explorers, his hands trembling slightly, pressed his ear against the stone. He swore he could hear faint echoes beyond, a hollow space, maybe even movement, though it might have been his imagination. They worked slowly, mindful not to collapse the passage, and then after hours of effort, a small section gave way. Cold air escaped from the darkness beyond, colder than anything they had felt before. It smelled of pine resin, ash, and something older, something almost human. They widened the opening just enough to slip through. Their lights cut through the dark, revealing a narrow corridor lined with unfinished stone. The walls bore no carvings, no markings, no signs of tools. It felt raw, untouched, and yet there was something intentional about it, as though Eustace had left this one place incomplete on purpose. The floor sloped downward for several yards before ending abruptly at a low archway. Beyond it, the tunnel opened into a small chamber no larger than a single room. What they found inside would forever change the way they saw the man who built it all. In the center of the chamber stood a chair, hand-carved, simple, and worn smooth from years of use. Beside it, a lantern still hung from a hook, its glass cracked but unbroken. And against the far wall, they saw shelves filled with notebooks, dozens of them bound in leather and stacked neatly as if waiting for someone to return. The explorers froze. No one spoke. One reached out and opened the topmost journal. The first page was dated nearly 30 years ago. The handwriting was unmistakably Eustace's, the same looping cursive found in his field notes and letters. The first words were written with deliberate calm. "If you're reading this, you have gone too far, but maybe that means you were meant to." He wrote about the years he had spent building Turtle Island, the sweat, the solitude, the joy of living close to the earth. But as the pages turned, the tone deepened. He spoke of disappointment with the world, of watching people lose their connection to what is real. "The forest doesn't lie," one passage read. "It gives and takes in perfect balance. But man keeps taking until there's nothing left to give." He described the tunnels as a reflection of his spirit, each one an attempt to go deeper, to understand the root of all things. He confessed that every time he dug, it wasn't about hiding from the modern world, but trying to find a place where he could finally listen to silence without interruption. "The deeper I go," he wrote, "the more the noise fades. I think the truth of the world lives somewhere beneath the soil, waiting for us to remember it." Then, near the end of one notebook, a line stood out. "I have built these tunnels not as an escape but as a return. When the time comes, I will leave the surface behind. My body will rest where the earth first spoke to me." The explorers exchanged glances, their faces pale in the lantern light. They began searching the chamber, tracing the walls, the floor, the corners. That's when one of them noticed a section of earth slightly raised near the back wall. The dirt was packed differently, smoother, newer. They knelt, brushing it gently away until the shape beneath became clear, a shallow depression lined with stones and covered with a thin layer of soil. It wasn't a grave in the traditional sense. It was something more symbolic, a resting place perhaps prepared but never used. And yet within that hollow lay a few objects, a leather hat, faded by time, a worn knife with a handle carved from bone, and a small wooden figure of a turtle, its shell split in two. It was as if Eustace had left pieces of himself behind, a final offering to the land that had shaped him. No one knew whether he had ever truly intended to die there, or if the chamber was meant to symbolize his surrender to the mountain. But standing in that room, surrounded by the silence he had carved with his own hands, it was impossible not to feel his presence. The tunnels weren't just passages through the earth. They were a map of Eustace Conway's soul. Each chamber, each turn, each carving told the story of a man who spent his life digging toward something greater than himself. When they left the chamber, the explorers sealed the entrance once more. They didn't mark it or photograph it. Some secrets, they decided, belonged to the earth. But the memory of what they saw followed them out of the darkness. The journals, the chair, the unfinished stone. It haunted them, not with fear, but with a kind of reverence. Because for the first time they truly understood what Eustace had been searching for all along. He wasn't running from society. He was running toward meaning. Every inch of Turtle Island, every cabin, every path, every tunnel was an act of devotion to a world most people had forgotten. In his silence, he spoke louder than any preacher or poet. He showed that freedom isn't found in isolation, but in surrender, in trusting the land and giving yourself back to it completely. The tunnels weren't his escape from the world. They were his way of returning home. When the last explorer stepped into the daylight, the mountains around them seemed to shimmer in the evening sun. The mist lifted slowly, curling through the trees like breath. They looked back at the hills, knowing what slept beneath, a labyrinth not of fear but of faith. And in that moment it was clear that what lay beneath Turtle Island wasn't a secret meant to shock the world. It was a message, a reminder that beneath all our noise and progress, beneath every road and city and clock, the old truth still waits, patient, eternal, and alive. The secret tunnel didn't just lead into the mountain. It led into Eustace Conway's heart, and perhaps into our own. Because when you listen closely, when you strip away the chaos of the modern world and stand alone in the stillness of the earth, you can almost hear it, that same pulse, that same whisper that called to him his entire life. "The earth beneath our feet is not dead," he wrote once. "It is the pulse of eternity." And now, after all these years, the world finally knows that pulse still beats beneath Turtle Island, echoing in the darkness Eustace Conway left behind, waiting for those brave enough to listen.